This presentation is brought to you by the California Department of Education and WestEd.
The California Department of Education's Learning and Development Foundations are general descriptions of children's behavior at 3 ages: at around 8 months of age, at around 18 months of age, and at around 36 months of age.
Good.
The Department of Education wanted to create the foundations so that we would have a common way of looking at significant development and learning during the first 3 years of life. They give us a way to hone in on very significant developments. Everything from empathy.
It's not that bad. It's not that bad. It's not that bad. Ooh, look what Elijah got for you.
To receptive language.
Here, Alec, can you put down the table? Put down the table for me. Thank you.
To children's understanding of cause and effect. To fine motor development. They give us a common language, a way to talk about what are those significant developments. The foundations are made up of 4 developmental domains: social emotional development, language development, cognitive development, and perceptual and motor development. The social emotional development domain is at the heart of early learning and development.
You can go get it?
The child's social emotional well-being and development will influence profoundly development in all other areas. It starts with relationships. Relationships children have with adults give them that sense of emotional security, which is so important for their long-term development.
You went around.
Relationships with other children are where they learn a lot of those early social skills and gain understanding about how to interact with others. We also need to focus on developing identity in this domain. During those first 3 years of life, children are gaining their first sense of self, and it's very important that we have an understanding for how that happens and how we can support it.
No, we gonna hugs and kisses? Okay, we do a different book. Want to do cars or another book? Thank you. Thank you. Gonna read to me? Thank you.
The language development domain focuses on the child's developing capacity to use language to communicate with us and create and share meaning.
Dad, check this out. What's this? Sheepy?
In the area of language development, when we looked at that research and worked with the experts on that research, it was clear that you could look at language development in a very detailed way. You could look at syntax, you could look at semantics.
There's one more thing I need you to get. Can you go get your cup?
But when we look at the research, what predicts overall language development is the child's ability to understand language.
There it is. All right. You can come put that in the bin too.
The child's ability to express himself or herself with language, to communicate with us, starting out by simply making sounds, and then words, and then simple sentences even.
No, look.
I noticed. Claire, tell me about your picture.
Can you please color in the rest?
You'd like me to color in the rest? Which part?
As children are learning language, as they're learning to express themselves with language, they're also learning the knowledge and skills that go into communicating.
Is this?
Looks like a squirrel.
Oh.
Does that one fit?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then finally, a very key part of language development is the child's developing interest in print.
Another baby. Look at this baby.
We know that in the early years, that engagement with books,
Kitty cat.
which is often modeled by adults and encouraged by adults, is so very important for infants. They fall in love with books, and we see how that development occurs at different ages.
¿Estás jugando al agua?
Sí.
Sí.
Jugando al agua.
The cognitive development domain is an area where we can see rich learning taking place in all different kinds of ways. Children are engaging all the time in trying to solve problems, exploring objects and new ideas. They're always trying to figure out how things work. They're fiddling with things. They're experimenting with cause and effect. They're seeing how one action they do leads to another action. Their memory is developing too, and they're becoming very interested in the fact that things can still exist even if you don't see them. Also, a very, very important part of cognitive development is imitation. So we have a more expanded way of looking at the details of cognitive development with the foundations. In the perceptual and motor development domain, children are using their senses and motor actions to gain knowledge about the world and determine or figure out how to navigate in that world. What's very interesting about the motor development area is how it relates to other areas of development. We can see how motor development is used to make social emotional connections. We can see how it's used while children are solving problems. Any number of those things come into play when we're looking at motor development.
Thank you.
What the foundations do for us is they give us a way to look at very specific behaviors in each one of the areas of development. When we use the foundations, however, we want to keep in mind that we have a whole child here. So, for example, we may be looking at relationships with peers, but at the same time, other things are going on that are very important to that child. So they're all interrelated, these behaviors, and we want to keep that in mind as we focus in on those very specific behaviors.
It's gonna fall down. It's gonna fall down.
You think it's gonna fall down, Claire? Let's see.
We present the foundations by showing representative examples of how children behave at each one of the age periods. We need to remember that these examples are ways of looking at the foundation. So when you look at the DVD, start to think of your own examples. Start to think of, well, my child doesn't do it exactly this way, but does it this way, and it fits with that description of the foundation. There are cultural differences. There are language development differences, language diversity, also individual differences. For example, in the DVD presentations, one of our representative examples around the recognition of ability, this is at around 18 months of age, we have two children. One child who finishes a puzzle, and each time he succeeds in finishing a puzzle, he loudly announces.
I did it!
He's sitting next to another child with a very different temperament, but also developing a recognition of ability. What we see with her when she finishes a puzzle successfully is she puts her hands together and has this look of satisfaction. So we have to be careful that we don't take the example to mean that's the way it is for all children. It's just an example. Sometimes it can be confusing when you look at the foundations. You might think, are these assessment items? But they're not intended to be assessment items, and they really don't work like assessment items. If you think of assessments, they're items on a scale.
What is that? A horse.
A horse?
People might ask, well, should I see if children at around 36 months of age are doing all the things described in the foundations, and if they're not, that becomes a way of telling me that that child is in some way not developing as we would expect. Does this mean that I have to teach children each of these foundations? And I think that concern comes from the way standards are used when children are older, that there is content that children are learning. At a certain grade level, they're learning how to do two-digit addition or subtraction, those kinds of things. The program for infant-toddler care tells us that infants have their own curriculum. What the foundations are not definitions of content we have to teach, but rather they provide us, if you will, a picture of that curriculum. So what the foundations do is they fill in the details for us. We know that part of that child's curriculum agenda is becoming empathic. We know that part of that child's learning agenda is gaining mastery over large motor development and being able to walk and run and jump. We know that part of that child's learning agenda is to be able to share meaning and make meaning in relationships with adults and children through language.
Hi, it's all the napping. Look, he's here.
The foundations help us better see, give us new eyes to see how do we connect with that child's agenda? What do we need to connect with? What do we need to support?
It's not fitting.
It's not fitting. What could you do to make it fit?
I broke it apart.
Break it apart.
Our hope is that you can use the foundations to gain a deeper understanding, and that the specific information each foundation provides about early behavior will better inform the ways you alter environments, engage in interaction, and encourage each child's learning and development.